In the remote hills of western Pennsylvania, where the Allegheny Mountains cast long shadows over forgotten valleys, there exists a cemetery that tells one of the most chilling stories in American history. The Brennan family plot contains 7 graves, 2 parents and 5 children. But here's what makes your blood run cold. All 5 Brennan children died on the exact same date, their 16th birthday. Between 1847 and 1863, each child reached this milestone only to vanish without a trace, their bodies found days later under circumstances so disturbing that local authorities buried the reports for over a century. The pattern was so precise, so methodical, that it defied every rational explanation the community could muster. What really happened to the Brennan children has remained one of Pennsylvania's darkest secrets, hidden in county records that were mysteriously sealed until 1987. Before we continue with the story of the Brennan family and uncover the truth behind these impossible deaths, I need you to help us grow this community of mystery seekers. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. You might be surprised to learn how many dark secrets your own hometown harbors. The truth behind what happened in Ligonier begins with understanding that some families carry burdens that span generations, and some debts demand payment long after those who incurred them have turned to dust. The story begins in 1831, when Cornelius Brennan, a skilled blacksmith from County Cork, arrived in the coal-rich valleys of Westmoreland County with his young wife, Bridget O'Sullivan Brennan. They settled in the small industrial town of Ligonier, where Cornelius quickly established himself as the finest metalworker within 50 miles. His forge became the heartbeat of the community, crafting everything from horseshoes to the intricate ironwork that adorned the growing town's most prosperous homes. Ligonier in the 1830s was a town caught between worlds. The original Scots-Irish settlers, who had carved their homesteads from these hills in the previous century, maintained their fierce independence and deep-rooted suspicions of outsiders. Coal mining was transforming the landscape, bringing waves of German immigrants, Pennsylvania Dutch families, and Irish Catholics like the Brennans. The social tensions were palpable. Protestant families whispered about Catholic superstitions, while the Irish kept to themselves, nursing memories of persecution back home. The town itself sprawled along the Loyal Hannah Creek, its main street lined with wooden buildings that seemed to lean toward each other like gossiping neighbors. The air carried the constant smell of coal smoke mixed with the metallic tang from Cornelius's forge and the earthy scent of the surrounding forests. Winter mornings brought fog that rolled through the valley like ghostly fingers, and summer evenings echoed with the sound of mill wheels and the distant calls of workers heading home through the gathering dusk. Bridget was known throughout the valley for her extraordinary beauty and her unsettling intelligence. Unlike most women of her era, she could read and write in both English and Gaelic, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes that made local farmers seek her counsel. She knew which plants would cure a fever and which combination of herbs could ease a difficult childbirth. The older Presbyterian wives viewed her knowledge with suspicion, whispering that no good Christian woman should know so much about ungodly things. The couple seemed blessed by fortune itself. Cornelius's business thrived as the railroad expansion brought new contracts, and by 1832, Bridget was pregnant with their first child. They built a substantial 2-story stone house on the hill overlooking the creek, its Gothic revival details crafted by Cornelius himself. The house stood apart from the town's other dwellings, both physically and symbolically, as if the Brennans existed in their own world within the larger community. It was into this complex social fabric that the Brennan children were born. Patrick arrived in 1832, followed by Mary in 1835, Thomas in 1838, Catherine in 1841, and finally little Michael in 1844. Each child was remarkably intelligent, inheriting their mother's keen mind and their father's meticulous attention to detail. They learned to read earlier than other children, spoke with an eloquence that impressed visiting merchants, and displayed an almost adult-like understanding of the world around them. Cornelius took great pride in teaching his sons the blacksmithing trade, showing them how to read the color of heated metal and feel the precise moment when iron became malleable. Meanwhile, Bridget instructed all her children in what she called the old knowledge, traditional Irish remedies, weather lore, and stories that her grandmother had told her back in Cork. She taught them to read the signs in animal behavior that predicted harsh winters, and how to identify the plants that could heal or harm. The family attended Sunday Mass at the small Catholic church that served the Irish community, though some of the older families whispered that Bridget's version of Catholicism seemed to incorporate elements that predated Christianity. She was often seen gathering specific flowers at dawn, hanging bundles of herbs in patterns that had no obvious purpose, and speaking to her children in rapid Gaelic whenever storms approached. As the 1840s progressed, the Brennan family became increasingly prosperous but also increasingly isolated. Cornelius had secured contracts to provide metalwork for the expanding Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, bringing wealth that allowed them to live comfortably while their neighbors struggled with economic uncertainty. But prosperity, as the people of Ligonier would learn, sometimes comes with a price that reveals itself only when it's too late to understand what was truly being purchased. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on March 15, 1847, the day Patrick Brennan turned 16. The morning began like any other, with Patrick working alongside his father in the forge, his strong young hands already skilled at shaping hot metal. He had grown into a handsome young man with his mother's intelligent green eyes and his father's steady temperament. The whole family was preparing for what was to be a modest celebration that evening. Bridget had spent days preparing Patrick's favorite meal of lamb stew with potatoes, and Cornelius had crafted a special hammer as his son's coming-of-age gift. The forge that morning rang with the familiar sounds of hammer on anvil, punctuated by father and son's easy conversation about techniques and future plans. Patrick spoke excitedly about taking on more responsibility in the business, perhaps even opening a second forge in nearby Greensburg. Thomas, then 9 years old, worked nearby organizing tools and watching his older brother with obvious admiration. But as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley, casting the stone house in golden light that seemed almost ethereal, Patrick simply vanished. One moment he was banking the forge fires with methodical precision, discussing with his father whether the evening's celebration should include music and dancing. The next moment, Thomas looked up from organizing iron rods to find Patrick's leather apron lying in the dirt beside the anvil, still warm from his body heat. The hammer Cornelius had crafted for his son's birthday, a beautifully balanced tool with intricate Celtic knotwork etched into the handle, lay glowing orange on the anvil where Patrick had been examining it moments before. The forge fire still burned bright, and the afternoon air shimmered with heat. But Patrick Brennan had disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. Thomas's screams brought Cornelius running from the house, and within minutes, neighbors began gathering in response to the boy's hysteria. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, who lived closest to the Brennan property, later told authorities that she had been hanging laundry and had a clear view of the forge area throughout the afternoon. She swore under oath that she never saw Patrick leave the workspace, never saw any strangers approach, never witnessed anything unusual until she heard Thomas screaming. The entire community mobilized for the search with a speed and determination that reflected both their respect for the Brennan family and their growing unease about Patrick's impossible disappearance. Sheriff Edmund Cartwright, a gruff man who had served in the Mexican-American War and prided himself on his rational approach to law enforcement, organized search parties that combed every hollow, every abandoned mine shaft, every creek bed within a 20-mile radius. They searched through the night by torchlight, their voices echoing off the hills as they called Patrick's name into the darkness. The search parties included men from every family in Ligonier, regardless of their religious or ethnic differences, Protestant and Catholic, Irish and German, working together with grim determination. Women prepared food and hot coffee for the searchers, while older children helped by carrying messages between the various teams. On the second day, They expanded the search to include the old Seneca trails that wound through the mountains, thinking perhaps Patrick had become lost or disoriented. Dr. Harrison Wells, the town's only physician, joined the search despite his advancing age, bringing medical supplies in case they found Patrick injured. The weather remained clear and cold, with temperatures that would make survival outdoors increasingly difficult for someone without proper clothing. On the third day, as hope began to fade and some searchers started whispering about abandoning the effort, Sheriff Cartwright's team found Patrick's body in a place they had already searched twice, a small clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek, about 2 miles from the Brennan homestead. The clearing was unremarkable, except for its perfect circular shape and the fact that no trees grew within its boundaries, leaving it open to the sky like a natural amphitheater. What they found there defied every natural law and rational explanation that these practical, hard-working people had ever encountered. Patrick lay on his back in the exact center of the clearing, his arms folded across his chest in the manner of a corpse prepared for burial by a loving undertaker. His clothes were immaculate, showing no signs of struggle, dirt, or even dew, despite having lain outdoors for 3 days of fluctuating temperatures and moisture. His face was peaceful, almost serene, with the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as if he had died while experiencing some beautiful dream. But his eyes were wide open and completely white. The pupils and irises had somehow vanished, leaving only the sclera visible, like polished marble orbs that reflected the afternoon sky with unnatural clarity. Dr. Wells examined the body with growing bewilderment and documented every detail with the methodical precision of a man trained in scientific observation. Patrick's skin showed no signs of violence, disease, or exposure. His hands were clean and uncalloused, as if he had never worked a day in the forge, though everyone knew he had been laboring beside his father just hours before his disappearance. His heart had simply stopped beating, but there was no medical explanation for why a healthy 16-year-old would die so suddenly and completely. Even more disturbing was the condition of the clearing itself. Every blade of grass within a perfect 15-foot circle around Patrick's body had died, turning brown and brittle overnight, as if touched by an instant autumn frost. The dead vegetation formed such a precise geometric pattern that it appeared to have been measured and marked by some meticulous supernatural surveyor. Sheriff Cartwright ordered the body moved to the church for viewing and funeral preparations, but something extraordinary happened that challenged the religious foundations of the entire community. Father McDermott, the Irish priest who had baptized Patrick 16 years earlier and watched him grow into a fine young man, found that he could not bring himself to enter the room where the boy's body lay. The priest described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and nausea whenever he approached the threshold, as if some invisible force was pressing against his chest and filling his lungs with ice water. His hands would shake uncontrollably, and he experienced what he later described as the sensation that I was walking toward my own grave. Eventually, after 3 failed attempts to perform his pastoral duties, Protestant minister Reverend Samuel Fletcher had to conduct the funeral service, though he later confided to friends that he had never felt such an oppressive atmosphere during any religious ceremony in his 30 years of ministry. The entire town attended Patrick's funeral, creating a procession that stretched from the church to the cemetery on the hill overlooking Ligonier. But what people remembered most vividly, what they discussed in hushed voices for years afterward, was Bridget Brennan's reaction to her son's death. Instead of the grief-stricken wailing that would have been expected from an Irish mother who had lost her firstborn, she stood silent and composed throughout the service, her green eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the gathered mourners. When well-meaning neighbors approached to offer comfort and ask how she was bearing such a tragedy, Bridget replied in a voice barely above a whisper, her Irish accent more pronounced than usual. "He was the first. 4 more must follow before the debt is paid." The words sent a chill through everyone who heard them, though none could understand what debt she meant or why she spoke with such certainty about future tragedies that no rational person could predict. Those words haunted Ligonier for the next 3 years, echoing through conversations and dreams like a prophecy that no one wanted to believe but couldn't quite dismiss. People began to watch the Brennan family with a mixture of sympathy and unease, noting changes in Bridget's behavior that seemed to confirm their growing suspicions that she possessed knowledge about her son's death that she refused to share. The changes in Bridget were subtle but unmistakable. Her auburn hair, which had been her pride and the envy of women throughout the valley, developed a single streak of pure white running from her left temple to the base of her neck. When neighbors commented on this striking change, she claimed to have no memory of how or when it had appeared, touching the white streak with confusion as if seeing it for the first time. More disturbing were her eyes. The bright green irises that had once sparkled with intelligence and warmth began to fade, taking on a grayish cast that made it difficult to meet her gaze directly. She started spending hours sitting in the clearing where Patrick's body had been found, carrying on what appeared to be one-sided conversations with the circle of dead grass that still marked the spot where her son had died. Local children reported seeing her there during thunderstorms, standing in the center of the dead circle with her arms raised to the sky, speaking rapidly in Gaelic while rain soaked through her clothes. When asked about these visits, Bridget would only say that she was keeping the connection strong and making sure the others understand what's expected. The whispers grew louder when, exactly 3 years later on March 15, 1850, 18-year-old Mary Brennan disappeared under circumstances that were identical in every detail to her brother's vanishing. Mary had been helping her mother with the household accounts that morning, displaying the mathematical skills that had impressed even Jeremiah Whitfield, the town's bank manager. She was known throughout the valley as a young woman of exceptional beauty and intelligence, already being courted by the sons of 3 of Ligonier's most prominent families. But at precisely 3:17 in the afternoon, the exact time Patrick had vanished 3 years earlier, Mary stepped out of the house to hang laundry on the line and was never seen alive again. Her younger brother Thomas, now 11, was playing in the yard when she disappeared. He later told authorities that he had been watching her pin sheets to the clothesline when she suddenly paused, tilted her head as if listening to something he couldn't hear, and then walked purposefully toward the woods without saying a word. The search followed the same pattern as before, but this time the townspeople searched with growing dread rather than hope. They knew, with the certainty that comes from witnessing the impossible once before, that they would find Mary in the same clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek. The search parties moved more slowly, reluctant to discover what they were certain they would find, yet unable to abandon the ritual of looking for someone they knew was already dead. They found her exactly where they expected, lying in the exact spot where Patrick had been discovered, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes white and sightless, surrounded by the same 15-foot circle of dead grass. But the circle had grown more defined, more perfectly geometric, as if each death refined and strengthened whatever force was claiming the Brennan children. Dr. Wells performed another examination, documenting the same impossible results with growing resignation. No cause of death, no signs of violence, no medical explanation for the cessation of life in a perfectly healthy 18-year-old. But this time, he noticed something else that chilled him to the bone and made him question his understanding of the natural world. When he lifted Mary's eyelids to examine the white orbs beneath, he saw his own reflection multiplied infinitely in what should have been the cornea, as if her eyes had somehow become mirrors, reflecting inward into some terrible depth that existed beyond the physical world. The effect was so disorienting that he had to step away from the body and compose himself before continuing his examination. The funeral drew an even larger crowd than Patrick's, including curious visitors from neighboring towns who had heard rumors of the mysterious Brennan deaths. Newspaper reporters from Pittsburgh arrived to document what they called the Ligonier mystery, though their articles would later be dismissed by urban readers as exaggerated tales from superstitious rural communities. Once again, Father McDermott found himself unable to officiate. this time experiencing symptoms so severe that Dr. Wells had to treat him for what appeared to be a panic attack. The priest claimed that approaching Mary's coffin felt like walking into a wall of ice, and that he could hear whispers in languages he didn't recognize whenever he tried to begin the funeral prayers. Reverend Fletcher again stepped in to conduct the service, but even he struggled with the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to surround the Brennan family during their moments of grief. Several attendees later reported feeling dizzy or nauseous during the ceremony, and more than one person claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving among the mourners, though no one could identify these mysterious presences when they looked directly at them. It was during Mary's funeral that townspeople first noticed the change in the local wildlife. Birds had stopped singing in the trees around the cemetery, and domestic animals showed obvious distress whenever they were brought near the Brennan family plot. Horses refused to pull carriages past the stone house, and dogs would howl mournfully whenever the wind carried scents from the direction of Loyalhanna Creek. As 1851 arrived, the atmosphere in Ligonia had changed completely. Where once the town had buzzed with the optimism of American expansion and industrial growth, now conversations stopped when the Brennan family was mentioned. Property values around their stone house began to drop precipitously, and several families quietly relocated to other parts of Pennsylvania, selling their homes for far less than their actual value. Those who remained found themselves watching the calendar with growing anxiety as March 15, 1853 approached, the date when Thomas Brennan would turn 16 and, if the pattern held, join his siblings in whatever fate had claimed them. The question that haunted everyone's thoughts was no longer whether Thomas would die, but how such an impossible pattern could continue, and what force was powerful enough to orchestrate such precise supernatural justice. Thomas Brennan was not only aware of the pattern threatening his life, he understood it with a clarity that terrified everyone around him. Unlike his younger siblings, Catherine and Michael, who were still too young to fully grasp the implications, Thomas had lived through both previous deaths and possessed an intelligence sharp enough to recognize that March 15, 1853 would likely be his last day on Earth. In the months leading up to his 16th birthday, Thomas's behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate as he tried every possible strategy to escape what seemed to be an inescapable fate. He spent nights sleeping in different locations, sometimes in the small Catholic church, curled up in a pew with Father McDermott's reluctant permission. Sometimes in Sheriff Cartwright's office, where the lawman allowed him to rest on a cot in the corner. Once even in the county jail, after he begged to be locked up for his own protection. Thomas consulted every authority figure he could find, seeking rational explanations and practical solutions. He spent hours with Dr. Wells, asking detailed questions about his siblings' deaths and proposing medical theories that might explain their mysterious fate. He met with both Father McDermott and Reverend Fletcher, exploring religious explanations and pleading for spiritual protection that neither clergyman felt qualified to provide. Most desperately, Thomas attempted to convince his parents to send him away from Ligonia entirely. He proposed traveling to relatives in Philadelphia, joining a westward wagon train, or even enlisting in the army under a false age declaration. But Cornelius and Bridget refused all his suggestions with a resignation that suggested they understood something about their family's situation that they refused to explain to their surviving children. Running won't change anything, Bridget told him one evening as they sat by the fire in their stone house, her grey eyes reflecting the flames with an otherworldly intensity. The debt follows the bloodline, not the location. Better to face it here, where at least we know what to expect, than to die alone among strangers who won't understand what's happening. Sheriff Cartwright, now a haunted man whose inability to solve the previous disappearances had aged him far beyond his years, agreed to place Thomas under protective custody for the week surrounding his birthday. The arrangement reflected both his genuine desire to save the boy and his professional need to finally solve a mystery that was destroying his reputation and his peace of mind. Thomas was locked in the most secure cell in the county jail, a stone-walled chamber with a single small window and a door that required 2 separate keys to open. 2 deputies maintained constant watch, working in shifts, to ensure that Thomas was never alone and that no one could approach him without their knowledge. The cell was searched daily for any items that might be used for self-harm, and Thomas's food was prepared and delivered by the sheriff's own wife to eliminate any possibility of poisoning. But the precautions proved useless against whatever force was claiming the Brennan children with such methodical precision. On the morning of March 15, 1853, Deputies Crawford and Murphy found Thomas's cell empty, despite the fact that it had been locked from the outside, and the keys had never left Sheriff Cartwright's possession. The window was too small for a human to pass through. The walls showed no signs of damage or disturbance, and the floor revealed no evidence that anyone had ever tried to dig an escape tunnel. Thomas Brennan had simply ceased to exist within the locked cell, leaving behind only his clothes folded neatly on the cot, and a message scratched into the stone wall with what appeared to be his fingernails. The debt must be paid in full. The old blood remembers what the new blood has forgotten. The scratches in the stone were deep and precise, cut with a force that should have been impossible for human fingernails to achieve. This time, the search party didn't bother checking other locations or organizing elaborate search efforts. The townspeople had learned to accept the impossible, and they went straight to the clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek, with the grim certainty of people attending a funeral they had already witnessed twice before. They found Thomas exactly where they expected, lying peacefully in the center of the dead circle that had grown more defined with each death. His 16-year-old body showed the same impossible signs as his siblings: the white eyes, the peaceful expression, the complete absence of any medical explanation for his death. But Thomas had left something behind that the others had not. Clutched in his right hand was a small piece of parchment covered with symbols that looked like a mixture of Irish Ogham script and something far older and more primitive. Dr. Wells carefully documented every detail of Thomas's condition, noting that the dead circle had expanded to nearly 20 feet in diameter and that strange plants were beginning to grow around its perimeter, species that he didn't recognize and couldn't identify in any of his botanical references. When he tried to remove the parchment from Thomas's hand to examine it more closely, the paper crumbled to dust at his touch, leaving only faint traces of the strange symbols burned into the boy's palm like brands. Father McDermott, despite his previous reluctance and the physical distress that approaching the Brennan deaths caused him, forced himself to examine the marks on Thomas's hand before the funeral. He later wrote in his private journal that the symbols were older than Christ, older than Rome, older than anything that should exist in a Christian land settled by God-fearing people. The priest's journal entry continued. These marks speak of debts that transcend the boundaries of individual lives, of payments demanded by forces that do not recognize the authority of church or state. I fear that the Brennan family has become caught in something that began long before they were born and will continue long after the last of them has paid the price that someone else incurred. Father McDermott burned his journal 3 days after writing those words, but not before making a single copy that he sealed in a metal box and hid in the church's cornerstone. A copy that would remain undiscovered for over a century when renovations in 1967 would finally bring those disturbing observations back to light. The pattern of supernatural rejection continued with Thomas's funeral as well. No Catholic priest could bring themselves to officiate, and this time even the Protestant ministers refused to participate, claiming that the very air around the Brennan family seemed to resist their prayers and make their voices falter. Cornelius again spoke over his son's grave, but those who attended later said that his voice had changed dramatically since Patrick's funeral 6 years earlier. It now carried an echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep well, and his words seemed to hang in the air longer than natural acoustics should have allowed. Bridget stood beside him, her streak of white hair now broader, and her eyes completely grey, watching the proceedings with an expression that suggested she was seeing something that existed beyond the visible world. After Thomas's funeral, the nature of the whispers in Ligonier changed completely. Where once people had speculated about possible rational explanations, poison, disease, hidden murder, family madness, now they spoke in hushed tones about curses, ancient debts, and forces that predated the Christian settlement of Pennsylvania. The town's Presbyterian minister, Reverend William MacLeod, began researching the pre-colonial history of the Loyalhanna Creek Valley, spending his own money on correspondence with scholars at Yale and Harvard who specialized in Native American history and European folklore. What Reverend MacLeod discovered in dusty archives and through careful interviews with elderly Seneca living on reservations in New York would provide the first rational explanation for the supernatural events terrorizing his community, though the truth he uncovered would prove far more disturbing than any of the wild theories that desperate townspeople had proposed to explain the impossible pattern of the Brennan deaths. As March 15, 1856 approached, the date when Catherine Brennan would turn 16, the town of Ligonier was gripped by a fear unlike anything in its brief but troubled history. Property values had collapsed so completely that entire blocks of houses stood empty, their windows boarded and their yards overgrown with weeds. Businesses were failing at an alarming rate as customers avoided the town center, and nearly half the population had abandoned their homes for safer locations in neighboring counties. The exodus had begun gradually after Thomas's death, but accelerated rapidly as the date of Catherine's 16th birthday drew near. Families packed their belongings in the middle of the night and left without saying goodbye to neighbors they had known for decades. The Irish families were the first to go, claiming that Bridget Brennan had brought shame and supernatural danger to their entire community, while the German immigrants followed soon after, muttering about old-world curses that had somehow followed them to the New World. Those who remained did so either because they lacked the resources to relocate or because they felt a morbid fascination with witnessing the completion of what everyone now understood to be a supernatural pattern that defied every law of nature and reason. Sheriff Cartwright had aged dramatically since his failure to protect Thomas, his hair gone completely gray, and his hands developing a permanent tremor that made it difficult for him to write official reports. Dr. Wells had begun keeping detailed records of every unusual event in Ligonier, documenting strange animal behavior, unexplained illnesses, and the increasing number of residents who reported disturbing dreams about white-eyed children calling to them from beside Loyalhanna Creek. His medical practice had dwindled to almost nothing as people began attributing every ailment to supernatural causes rather than natural disease. Catherine herself had spent 3 years preparing for her fate with a composure that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. Unlike Thomas, who had fought desperately against his destiny, she seemed to have accepted it with the same unnatural calm that her mother displayed. She spent her final months learning everything she could about her family's history, questioning Bridget about their origins in Ireland and the circumstances that had brought them to this specific valley in Pennsylvania. It was during these conversations that Bridget finally revealed the truth she had hidden for 25 years, sharing secrets that would explain the supernatural pattern claiming her children and provide a glimpse into forces that most 19th century Americans could never have imagined. The revelations came slowly, shared during long evening conversations beside the fire in their stone house, while the wind outside carried sounds that no longer seemed entirely natural. "The Brennan name is older than you know," Bridget told her daughter as they sat together in the parlor that had once been filled with the laughter of 5 children. "We are not simply Irish immigrants seeking a better life in America. Our bloodline carries responsibilities that were placed upon us centuries ago, debts that must be paid regardless of our personal wishes or desires." Bridget explained that their family descended from a line of Druids who had fled Ireland during the English persecutions of the 17th century, carrying with them ancient knowledge and obligations that connected them to forces older than Christianity. Cornelius himself was unaware of his wife's true heritage, believing he had married a simple Catholic girl whose only unusual trait was her skill with herbal remedies. "But the land knows," Bridget continued, her grey eyes reflecting the firelight with an intensity that made Catherine shiver despite the warmth of the room. The earth remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, every injustice committed, every debt incurred. When we settled beside Loyal Hannah Creek, I felt the pull immediately. The same force that had guided our ancestors for generations was calling us to this place for a specific purpose. Catherine asked her mother why she had allowed the family to settle in a place she knew to be connected to their ancient obligations, why she had brought children into the world, knowing the price they might be required to pay. Bridget's response would haunt Catherine's final days and provide insight into the terrible logic that governed their supernatural situation. Because the debt was not created by us, but it could only be paid by us, Bridget explained. Our bloodline carries the spiritual energy necessary to balance an injustice that was committed nearly a century ago in this very valley. If we had tried to run, if we had refused our obligations, the debt would have followed us wherever we went and demanded payment under circumstances far more terrible than what we face here. She revealed that their arrival in Ligonier had not been coincidental. They had been drawn to the valley by the same forces that had claimed Patrick, Mary, and Thomas. The supernatural pattern was not random persecution, but a carefully orchestrated spiritual transaction designed to restore balance to a place where violence and injustice had disrupted the natural order of life and death. Each death strengthens the connection, Bridget told her daughter. Each child who pays the price brings us closer to completing an obligation that will free the remaining members of our bloodline from the ancient debt. When the final payment is made, when the last child has joined his siblings in whatever realm exists beyond this one, the survivors will be released from the bonds that have governed our family for 3 centuries. As Catherine's 16th birthday approached, other strange phenomena began manifesting throughout Ligonier with increasing frequency and intensity. Residents reported hearing children's voices singing Irish lullabies in the woods beside Loyal Hannah Creek, though no children lived anywhere near that area. Animals refused to cross certain paths through the town, creating invisible barriers that forced people to take long detours around areas that had once been perfectly normal. The weather itself seemed to respond to the approaching deadline. Temperatures fluctuated wildly from day to day, with spring warmth suddenly giving way to winter cold that killed early flowers and left ice formations in patterns that resembled Celtic knots. The wind carried scents that had no identifiable source, burning peat that reminded older Irish residents of their homeland, and something else underneath that smelled like ancient earth and very old bones. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Ligonier intensifies to levels that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Catherine Brennan faces the same fate that claimed her 3 siblings. On the morning of March 15, 1856, Catherine Brennan rose before dawn and dressed in her finest clothes, a white dress that Bridget had been sewing for months in preparation for this day. The dress was unlike anything seen in Ligonier before, incorporating traditional Irish patterns with symbols that seemed to blend Celtic designs with something far more primitive and ancient. Instead of trying to flee or hide like Thomas had done, Catherine spent her final hours visiting every remaining family in Ligonier, saying goodbye to the people who had watched her grow from a child into a young woman of extraordinary grace and intelligence. Her visits were brief but memorable. She thanked each family for their kindness to the Brennans, asked forgiveness for any disruption their supernatural situation had caused the community, and left behind small gifts that she had been preparing for weeks. Her final stop was the home of Dr. Wells, where she asked him to promise that he would continue documenting the deaths in her family, no matter how inexplicable they seemed to rational medical understanding. "Someone must bear witness," she told him, her voice carrying the same echo that had begun affecting her father's speech. "Someone must remember that we lived, that we loved, that we were more than just the sum of this terrible pattern that has claimed us." At exactly 3:17 in the afternoon, The precise time when each of her siblings had vanished, Catherine walked calmly out of Ligonier and toward Loyalhanna Creek, following the path that had become as familiar to the townspeople as the route to their own cemetery. Dozens of remaining residents followed at a respectful distance, creating a somber procession that stretched for nearly a quarter-mile along the creek path. The scene that unfolded in the clearing beside Loyalhanna Creek on March 15, 1856, would be seared into the memories of everyone who witnessed it, creating accounts that would be passed down through generations of Ligonier families like a shared nightmare that refused to fade with time. Catherine entered the clearing with the dignity of a young woman attending her own wedding rather than her own death. The circle of dead grass had continued to expand with each previous death and now measured nearly 25 feet in diameter, its edges so perfectly geometric that they appeared to have been drawn with mathematical instruments. Strange plants had grown around the perimeter, species that Dr. Wells would later identify as varieties that had been extinct in Pennsylvania for over a century. The gathered crowd watched in silence as Catherine walked to the exact center of the clearing and knelt down, her white dress spreading around her like the petals of some funeral flower. She folded her hands in her lap and began speaking in what sounded like Irish Gaelic, though several of the older Irish residents later claimed that her words contained elements of languages far older than anything they had ever heard. For 17 minutes, nothing visible happened. Catherine knelt in the center of the clearing, appearing to pray or meditate peacefully in the afternoon sun, her voice carrying across the valley in a rhythmic chant that seemed to harmonize with the wind moving through the surrounding trees. The gathered crowd held its collective breath, some praying silently, others simply watching with the fascination of people witnessing something that would redefine their understanding of reality. Then, at exactly 3:34 p.m., every person present heard the same sound, a low, mournful cry that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like the voice of the valley lamenting another life claimed by ancient justice. The sound was unlike anything in their experience, neither animal nor human, but carrying within it echoes of grief that seemed to encompass centuries of accumulated sorrow. As the cry faded, Catherine's body underwent the same transformation that had claimed her siblings. Her eyes turned the familiar white, her face took on the peaceful expression of someone experiencing a beautiful dream, and her heart simply stopped beating. But unlike Patrick, Mary, and Thomas, whose deaths had been discovered after the fact, Catherine's passing occurred before witnesses who would carry the memory of her final moments for the rest of their lives. What made Catherine's death even more disturbing was that her lips continued moving for nearly an hour after her heart had stopped beating, forming silent words that several witnesses claimed they could understand despite being unable to hear any sound. Dr. Wells, who had positioned himself close enough to observe these final communications, later reported that Catherine seemed to be speaking in multiple languages: English, Irish Gaelic, and something that sounded like no human tongue he had ever encountered. Several members of the crowd claimed they could interpret fragments of what she was saying. Apologies to the community for the disruption her family's situation had caused, explanations about debts and obligations that transcended individual lifetimes, and most disturbing of all, detailed descriptions of how and when young Michael Brennan would complete the pattern 7 years in the future. The supernatural phenomena surrounding Catherine's death were more intense than anything that had accompanied the previous tragedies. The circle of dead grass expanded immediately to a diameter of 30 feet, and within that boundary, the temperature dropped by at least 20 degrees, creating a visible frost that formed intricate patterns resembling Celtic knots and symbols that no one could identify. More disturbing still were the shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources within the expanded circle. Witnesses reported seeing figures that appeared to be children dancing around Catherine's kneeling form, though when they looked directly at these apparitions, nothing was visible except shifting patterns of light and darkness that hurt their eyes to observe for more than a few seconds. The death of Catherine Brennan marked a turning point in the supernatural siege of Ligonier that went far beyond the pattern established by the previous deaths. Unlike the earlier tragedies, which had been followed by periods of relative calm, Catherine's passing seemed to intensify the otherworldly presence that had claimed the valley, as if her death had opened a doorway that allowed forces from beyond the physical world to exert greater influence over the realm of the living. Over the following weeks, residents reported phenomena that challenged every rational explanation their practical minds could devise. Animals throughout the valley began behaving in ways that defied their natural instincts. Domestic cats refused to hunt mice, dogs howled continuously during daylight hours, and horses would only travel in perfectly straight lines, refusing to follow curved roads or paths that might take them near the clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek. The weather patterns became increasingly erratic and unnatural. Rain fell in geometric patterns that left some areas completely dry, while saturating others only feet away. Snow appeared during warm afternoons and melted upward instead of downward, creating visual effects that made witnesses question their own sanity. Most unsettling of all was the sound of children laughing that could be heard coming from the clearing during the darkest hours of the night, accompanied by what sounded like traditional Irish dancing music played on instruments that created melodies unlike anything heard in the physical world. Cornelius Brennan, who had maintained his stoic composure through the loss of 3 children, finally broke completely after Catherine's funeral. Neighbors found him in his forge 3 days later, having systematically destroyed every piece of metalwork he had ever created, his hands bloodied from beating his fists against the anvil where his children had once learned their father's trade. The tools that had been his pride and livelihood lay twisted and broken around the workspace, transformed into abstract sculptures of grief and rage. When Dr. Wells examined Cornelius, he found that the man's eyes had developed the same grayish cast as his wife's, and he spoke only in fragmented sentences about paying debts and finishing what was started. His voice carried the same otherworldly echo that had affected his speech during Thomas's funeral. But now the effect was so pronounced that his words seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously, as if he were somehow speaking in harmony with voices that existed in other dimensions. Bridget had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. The streak of white in her hair had spread until her entire head was silver, and her eyes had faded to such a pale gray that they appeared almost colorless in certain light, like windows looking into an empty sky. She stopped speaking English entirely, communicating only in rapid Irish Gaelic that even the other Irish families in Ligonier found difficult to understand. She spent her days sitting beside Catherine's grave, carrying on animated conversations with the headstone, as if receiving detailed responses to her questions and comments. Those brave enough to approach closely reported that she seemed to be discussing practical matters, household management, family finances, and preparations for what she referred to as the final payment. Indeed, the conversation suggested that she was receiving guidance from beyond the grave about how to prepare for Michael's approaching 16th birthday and the completion of whatever supernatural transaction had been claiming her children with such methodical precision. As the months passed, the surviving members of the Brennan family became increasingly isolated from the remnants of Ligonier's population. Cornelius abandoned his blacksmith shop entirely, and the forge fires that had burned continuously for over 20 years finally went cold, leaving the stone building silent and empty, like a monument to a vanished way of life. Young Michael, now 12 years old and acutely aware that he had 4 years until his 16th birthday, began displaying symptoms that went far beyond normal childhood anxiety about mortality. He aged rapidly during this period, developing grey streaks in his dark hair and lines around his eyes that made him look decades older than his chronological age. His voice changed as well, taking on the same echoing quality that affected his parents, though in his case the effect created harmonies that sounded almost musical. The boy stopped sleeping for days at a time, claiming that closing his eyes brought visions of his siblings calling to him from the clearing by the creek, showing him glimpses of whatever realm they now inhabited and describing the role he would play in completing their family's supernatural obligations. When exhaustion finally forced him to rest, neighbors reported hearing him carry on detailed conversations with invisible companions throughout the night, discussions that seemed to involve complex negotiations about timing, circumstances, and the specific nature of the final payment that would settle the ancient debt once and for all. It was during this period of escalating supernatural activity that Reverend MacLeod made the discovery that would provide the first complete explanation for the events that had terrorized Ligonier for nearly a decade. His years of painstaking research into the pre-colonial history of the Loyalhanna Creek Valley had finally yielded results that were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. Working with scholars at Eastern universities and conducting careful interviews with elderly Seneca living on reservations in New York, MacLeod had uncovered the historical foundation upon which the Brennan family's supernatural obligations were built. The revelation would forever change how the people of Ligonier understood their valley and the forces that governed life and death within its boundaries. In 1754, nearly a century before the Brennan family's arrival in Pennsylvania, a group of Scots-Irish settlers had established a temporary camp beside Loyalhanna Creek while scouting locations for permanent homesteads. The camp was attacked by a war party of Seneca warriors who viewed the European presence as a violation of sacred ground that had been used for spiritual ceremonies for countless generations. The attack resulted in 17 colonist deaths, but not before the settlers had managed to capture 5 Seneca warriors, including a young shaman named Guyasuta, who was said to possess extraordinary spiritual powers that connected him directly to the forces that governed the natural world. In their fear and rage, the colonists executed all 5 captives in the clearing beside the creek, believing that eliminating the spiritual leadership of the war party would prevent future attacks. According to tribal oral histories that MacLeod collected from Seneca elders, Guyasuta used his final moments to pronounce a curse upon the valley that would claim 5 lives in retribution for the 5 Seneca deaths, but only when the proper bloodline had settled on the cursed ground and the spiritual conditions were aligned for the ancient debt to be collected. The curse was not simply about revenge, MacLeod learned, but about restoring spiritual balance to a place where sacred ground had been violated and innocent blood had been shed through ignorance and fear. The 5 deaths would provide the spiritual energy necessary to heal the supernatural wound that had been inflicted upon the valley, allowing the souls of the executed Seneca to find peace and removing the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds that their unjust deaths had created. The final act in the tragedy of the Brennan family began not on March 15, 1863, but 3 days earlier, when 12-year-old Michael Brennan disappeared from his family's stone house in a manner that differed dramatically from his siblings' vanishings. Unlike Patrick, Mary, Thomas, and Catherine, who had disappeared at the moment they turned 16, Michael seemed to have been claimed early by the supernatural forces that had stalked his bloodline for over a decade. The search for Michael followed a pattern that was both familiar and distinctly different from the previous disappearances. Instead of organizing community search parties, the few remaining residents of Ligonier seemed to accept that the boy was beyond human help, that whatever force had been claiming the Brennan children had accelerated its schedule for reasons that only made sense within the context of supernatural justice that governed their situation. Only Cornelius and Bridget searched for their youngest child, spending 3 days and nights calling his name through the hills and hollows of Westmoreland County, while their former neighbors watched from behind curtained windows, too frightened to offer assistance but too fascinated to look away completely. The couple moved through the landscape like ghostly figures themselves, their voices carrying across the valley with the same otherworldly echo that had begun affecting their speech after Catherine's death. On the morning of March 15th, what would have been Michael's 16th birthday if he had lived to reach that milestone, his parents found him in the clearing beside Loyalhanna Creek, but his situation was unlike anything they had witnessed with his siblings. Michael was standing upright in the center of the dead circle, which had now expanded to cover nearly the entire clearing. his arms raised toward the sky and his lips moving in what appeared to be an ancient chant or prayer that harmonized with sounds coming from the earth itself. His eyes showed the familiar white of his dead siblings, but unlike them, he was still breathing, still moving, still somehow alive, despite showing all the supernatural signs that had marked the deaths of Patrick, Mary, Thomas, and Catherine. The transformation had begun, but not completed, leaving Michael suspended between life and death in a state that defied every natural law. Bridget approached her son carefully, speaking to him in the Irish Gaelic that had become her primary language since Catherine's funeral, using endearments and phrases from his childhood in an attempt to reach whatever remained of his consciousness within the supernatural transformation that was claiming him. Michael turned toward her voice, and for a moment his white eyes seemed to focus on her face with an intensity that suggested he could still see her, despite the otherworldly change that had overtaken his vision. In a voice that carried the echo of the valley itself, harmonizing with sounds that seemed to come from deep within the earth, Michael spoke his final words. "The debt is paid, Mother. The old ways return. The land will remember what it was before the strangers came. The 5 are now complete, and the circle closes as it was meant to close. At exactly 3:17 p.m., the precise time when each of his siblings had vanished from the physical world, Michael Brennan's heart stopped beating. But unlike Patrick, Mary, Thomas, and Catherine, whose bodies had collapsed to the ground at the moment of death, Michael remained standing in the center of the clearing, his arms still raised skyward, his face turned toward the March sun that had witnessed 4 previous deaths in this same cursed place. The transformation of the clearing began immediately and was far more dramatic than anything that had accompanied the earlier deaths. The circle of dead grass that had expanded with each previous tragedy suddenly erupted in new growth. Not the familiar Pennsylvania flora that had once covered the area, but plants that had not grown in the valley for over a century. Wild rice, ghost pipe, bloodroot, and other species sacred to the Seneca Nation pushed through the soil as if summoned by Michael's final breath, creating a garden that belonged to a different era and a different understanding of the relationship between human beings and the natural world. The plants grew with supernatural speed, reaching full maturity within hours and creating patterns that formed recognizable symbols when viewed from the surrounding hills. Cornelius and Bridget remained in the clearing until sunset, standing beside their son's upright corpse and watching as the supernatural transformation continued around them, reshaping the landscape in ways that honored the spiritual traditions that had existed in the valley long before European settlement. As darkness fell, witnesses from the town reported seeing lights dancing through the trees around Loyalhanna Creek. Not the warm yellow of lanterns or torches, but the cold blue-white glow of foxfire or spectral energy that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. By morning, both Cornelius and Bridget Brennan were dead, their bodies found lying at the base of Michael's feet, as if they had knelt in supplication before their son's standing corpse and simply chosen to join him in whatever realm existed beyond the physical world. Dr. Wells, who performed the final examinations of his career on the remaining Brennan family members, found no cause of death for the parents. Their hearts had simply stopped beating simultaneously sometime during the night, as if their life force had been voluntarily surrendered to complete the supernatural transaction that had been claiming their children. The funeral for the final 3 members of the Brennan family drew visitors from as far away as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, including newspaper reporters, spiritualists, academic researchers, and curiosity seekers who hoped to document the conclusion of what had become known throughout Pennsylvania as the Ligonier Curse. Representatives from major newspapers arrived to cover what they expected to be the final chapter in a story that had captured the imagination of readers throughout the eastern United States. But when the funeral procession arrived at the clearing to collect the bodies for burial, they found only Michael still standing in the center of the supernatural garden that had grown around him. Cornelius and Bridget had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their clothes and the lingering scent of burning peat that reminded witnesses of the bogs of rural Ireland and carried with it associations of ancient rituals and older ways of understanding the relationship between life and death. Michael's body was eventually moved to the town cemetery, where it was buried in a grave beside his siblings in a ceremony that drew observers from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. But even in death, he continued to defy natural law in ways that confirmed the supernatural nature of everything that had transpired over the previous 16 years. The headstone placed over Michael's grave cracked down the middle within a week of installation, splitting along a perfectly straight line that divided his name into two equal parts. Every attempt to replace the damaged stone resulted in the same supernatural destruction, with new headstones developing identical cracks within days of being set in place. Eventually, the cemetery authorities gave up and left Michael's grave unmarked, though visitors to the site report that the spot remains clearly visible even today. The grass grows in a perfect spiral pattern that can be seen from several hundred feet away and continues to grow regardless of weather conditions or seasonal changes. The town of Ligonier never recovered from the 16-year ordeal that had claimed the Brennan family and transformed their peaceful valley into a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds had been permanently altered. By 1865, more than 3/4 of the population had relocated to other parts of Pennsylvania, abandoning homes and businesses they had spent decades building rather than continue living in a place where such impossible events could occur. The remaining residents found themselves living in a community haunted not just by memories of supernatural terror, but by the ongoing presence of forces that seemed to have been awakened by the completion of the Brennan deaths. The clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek became a pilgrimage site for spiritualists, researchers, and curiosity seekers from around the world. But local authorities eventually cordoned off the area after several visitors reported experiencing temporary blindness, hearing voices in unknown languages, and in 3 documented cases, developing the same white-eyed condition that had affected the Brennan and children. Reverend MacLeod's research papers, discovered in the Presbyterian Church after his death in 1871, provided the most complete explanation for the events that had terrorized Ligonier for nearly 2 decades. According to his final notes, the curse of Gayasuta had indeed been fulfilled with the death of the 5 members of the Brennan bloodline, but its completion had not brought the supernatural revenge against European settlement that some tribal oral histories had suggested. Instead, MacLeod theorized based on his extensive correspondence with Seneca elders and his study of pre-Christian Celtic traditions. The spiritual energy harvested from the Brennan deaths had been used not for destruction, but for healing, the restoration of the natural balance that had been disrupted by violence and cultural misunderstanding over a century earlier, the transformation of the clearing into a sanctuary for native plant species, the peaceful nature of all 5 deaths, despite their supernatural circumstances, and the voluntary joining of Cornelius and Brigid with their offspring, suggested that the curse had evolved beyond its original purpose into something more complex and ultimately more merciful than simple retribution. The records of the Brennan family tragedy were sealed by court order in 1867 and remained locked away in the Westmoreland County Courthouse until 1987. When they were finally released to researchers studying patterns of unexplained deaths in rural Pennsylvania. By that time, the clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek had become part of a state nature preserve, and the supernatural phenomena that had once terrorized the valley had faded into local folklore and academic curiosity. But the questions raised by the Brennan family's fate continue to challenge our understanding of the forces that govern life and death, justice and retribution, in ways that transcend the boundaries of rational explanation. How could 5 healthy children die at exactly the same age, at precisely the same time of day, in the exact same location, with no medical explanation for their deaths? What power could orchestrate such a precise pattern of supernatural justice across nearly 2 decades? And most disturbing of all, How many other families might be carrying similar debts that were incurred by ancestors they never knew, in places they've never been, for crimes they never committed? The story of the Brennan family reminds us that some obligations transcend individual lifetimes, that actions taken in one generation can echo through centuries to demand payment from those who never knew they owed anything at all. They paid a price that had been set before they were born, in a land their ancestors never knew, for injustices they never committed but that their bloodline was somehow required to balance. This mystery shows us that the past is never truly past, that the ground beneath our feet remembers everything that has happened upon it, and that sometimes the only way to heal old wounds is through sacrifices that seem impossibly cruel to those who are required to make them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that ancient curses can reach across centuries to claim modern victims? Or was there a rational explanation for the impossible deaths that claimed 5 children on their 16th birthdays? Could the Brennan family have escaped their fate if they had made different choices? Or were they bound by forces too powerful for human will to overcome? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened in the hills of Western Pennsylvania. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that explore the dark corners of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the world. See you in the next video.